tonight's cry self-explanatory. Mark Devlin, who was a good friend of ours. He's been a few times, always entertaining, always thought-provoking. He's going to do a talk tonight. And then at the end, so tonight basically about an hour and a quarter on the first part of the talk, then a quick break, an hour and a quarter for the second part of the talk, and then he's going to announce when he's going into the 20-minute comedy set, to finish it off, I am going to send some staff down to take orders at the tables, so you don't have to get up and out. There is toilets through them doors, so the lights will be on, so you don't have to go into the main bar unless you want to. The top bar toilets are open as well. Fire exits, as you can see, self-explanatory. Once that's had, one's open at the moment. You can go out off the top to where the toilets are, straight out, and there is a fire exit just at the top of the ramp. So that's all the formal stuff. What I'm going to do is hand over to Graham for a couple of minutes, maybe even 30 seconds. But I've never known Graham speak for 30 seconds. So I'm going to hand over to Graham because people have asked a little bit about how tomorrow's been and Sunday's being planned. We have got some entertainment in between things. If the weather's good, that entertainment will be outside on the bench areas. Definitely on Sunday it will be outside if the weather's with us, and that's with Skybest, who's a well-known local soul and Motown singer, and he is always very entertainment, and that'll be from 2 till 4 o'clock. We will have some singers tomorrow, but I'm not sure when and how they're getting here yet. But we have got disco karaoke on tomorrow night, and the DJ is also a reggae singer. So if we have got some spells where we haven't got the entertainment here, then Mark will likely do a reggae set. So that's all that planned. I'll hand you over to Graham now. After Graham, Mark will start the presentation.
Hello. Hopefully this is working okay. So if you don't know who I am, my name's Graham Moore. Online I'm known as Daddy Dragon. I'll tell the story about how I got my name. But tomorrow we have got the English Constitution parties. It's an annual conference, but we're not like other political parties. We don't do one in March and we don't do one in September. We go to Runnymede or places like this where normal people can come and talk to us. Anyone who knows me will know I'm not a politician and I'm not a diplomat. I just tell it the way it is. But we have a manifesto which is the English Constitution, and we explain that to people. And what I'll be talking about tomorrow, apart from us actually voting, so even if you're not a member, it will be good if you come along because I'll explain some things about voting, why you must vote. Abstaining is not a good idea. That's what got us into the mess that we're into now. And that starts at 10 a.m. tomorrow, where I'll go through the Constitution and talk to you about what we do strategically. And that's from 10 till 1. Then there's a sing-up, and then 3 till 6 is questions and answers. It's mainly about, tomorrow's mainly about the political elements. You can ask me any question you want, even my opinion on Restore, Reform, the Labour Party, any question that you want to write or put into us. And the other one is on Sunday, English Constitution Society. That is educational only. It's nothing to do with politics. Again, it's all to do with the English Constitution. I show you that we do have a constitution, we do have a written constitution, and again, that because it's Sunday, it starts at 11 until 2. But we'll also be focusing on slavery, and it was the English, not the British, that stopped slavery. I'll explain that to you and explain many other parts of that subject so you understand that we, as working people, didn't stop paying the bill for that until 2015, yet we've never owned any slaves. So all of that's going to be quite important. And then you've got, literally, questions and answers. And then 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. is the Scar Ban, and then 4 p.m. onwards It's just a chit chat and a mingle and a chill out. That's it. And just in case you don't know, I used to be on lots of platforms and got banned and banned and banned. I'm now on Rumble more than anywhere else. But one of our subscribers has kindly given me a present tonight, and that's that. You're on mute. So, again, Mark, we've come to see Mark tonight. A lot of what Mark talks about resonates with me. There is something in psychology where they start reframing your mind. I call it a mind virus. They did it with COVID. They've done it with many things. So this tonight is really important in my view because you're explaining how they get to your mind. They are very clever people. They're not stupid. So that's it. Tomorrow 10 a.m. and Sunday starts at 11. Thank you very much for everyone.
Cheers, Graham. Cheers, Paddy. Hello, everyone. Hello. Good to see you. Great turnout this evening. So, this presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part, as Paddy mentioned, is about an hour and a quarter, and that's all about MK Ultra. And then the second part, after a break, is going to be about Tavistock, which is a name synonymous with mass mind control and social engineering in the UK. And then I'll be finishing off with my brief comedy set, and I'm feeling particularly sarcastic and acerbic and cynical and world-weary and jaded tonight, so that could go quite well. We'll see anyway. So some of you will know me and some of you won't. For those who don't, I used to be a club and radio DJ full-time. I did that for about 20 odd years, and during that period I thought, same as most people, that the music industry was all about harmless fun and entertainment. Just chilling out, letting your hair down after a hard day at work, you know, and listening to some favourite music. But round about 2007, I started to pay attention to some of the stuff that was happening in the world. And I came to realise that the world is not run by the people we're told it is. You could say I was a slow learner, but I got there in the end. And this filters down to every aspect of organised society and our daily lives. So, of course, we know that politics is completely controlled and contrived, and a lot of people have come to realise that it's the same with the so-called medical industry, it's the same with academia, it's the same with the world of big business, it's the same with the world of the military. But a lot of people don't acknowledge that that same level of control is there when it comes to entertainment and popular culture, because it masquerades as just that. But really, these are the perfect vehicles through which to get mass mind control done, and to shape and mould people's perceptions and viewpoints and prejudices even. And that's been going on for a very long time. So I mainly talk now about how the music industry is manipulated in this way, and most of my presentations go into the fine detail of that. I thought this evening it would be interesting for me to home in on some of the methods and tactics that are used specifically with mind control. And there is a lot of overlap here with my music industry work, but this first part is all about the far-reaching tentacles of MK Ultra mind control coming through those nice folks at the CIA, who have been in breach of their contract pretty much since day one, because they're not supposed to be meddling with this sort of stuff. But they are the world's leading experts on mind control, as we'll see. So MK Ultra is a very far-reaching program using different methodologies. And the project involves behavioural scientists and psychologists whose full-time job it is to work out how the human psyche works, and therefore how it can be shaped and moulded and manipulated. It's all they do, all day long. It's incredible that people are okay with doing this for a living, but they clearly are. So MK Ultra dates back to the Cold War era, post-World War II, when the CIA was morphing out of the Office of Strategic Services, which was its original identity. And ostensibly, MK Ultra was first introduced as a weapon in the so-called Cold War against the Russians. And the way it was justified was that it was designed to produce things like truth serums drugs that could cause an enemy captor to reveal secrets, and drugs that could also prevent American military personnel that might get captured by the enemy from revealing secrets. And also it focused in on things like remote viewing and astral projection even, going into kind of metaphysical realms, as we'll see. But it was a very real thing. There's documentation to show that this project ran, and in my view it probably still is. Officially it was wound up in the 1970s, but I think it just went underground and off the books, and we find that it is still operating in ever more elaborate ways. Officially it got underway in 1953, and this is a screenshot from the CIA's own website, where they actually admit to the existence of CIA, of MKUltra. So it says here, in the 1950s, the CIA secretly contracted with an unidentified professor of neurology to go to an unnamed state prison facility and experiment on an unrevealed number of convicts. So a lot of the early experimentations were done in prisons, also in mental institutions, and also in hospitals. Here's some more documentation. This is a heavily redacted document, but it's dated April 13th, 1953, which is when MKUltra officially got off the ground. Here's another one. There's no end of documentation to prove that MKUltra was a very real thing. So officially, according to CIA Director Richard Helms, this was all wrapped up in 1973. But like I say, I'm not buying that one. A lot of the early experimentation was done at the Allen Memorial here at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And the CIA did a lot of the experiments here to get around the fact that they shouldn't be taking place on American soil. So they went just over the border into Canada and conducted a lot of them here just to take the spotlight off of them slightly. This guy was responsible for many of the experiments that took place at McGill. His name was Dr. Ewan Cameron, or Donald Ewan Cameron. Do you think he might have been Scotsman? And this guy was an absolutely vicious psychopath. There are many survivors of the MKUltra program who've spoken of what it was like to be under this guy's watch. He would use things like electroshock, so-called therapy, applying electrical shocks to elicit certain reactions, mind-altering drugs, and things like sensory deprivation tanks, where subjects would be placed inside one of these things, cut off from the outside world, in complete darkness, often floating in salt water, to see what happens to the mind when it has its access to all the senses shut down in this way. The subjects were there against their will, and nobody signed a contract saying they agreed to having this stuff done to them. I'm going to be mentioning the Netflix TV series Stranger Things a couple of times. I don't really watch TV much, but I was put onto this particular show because it drops a lot of truth bombs, and it tells us a lot about what really goes on in the world. Specifically, it goes into MKUltra, and there's a doctor in the show, Dr. Martin Brenner, played by Matthew Modine here, who I think was modelled very strongly on Dr. Ewan Cameron. So I'll be discussing Stranger Things a bit more as we go on, as I say. But another movie which told us a lot about MKUltra in its early days is one you might be familiar with. Going back to 1962, it was called The Manchurian Candidate. It starred Lawrence Harvey, Frank Sinatra was in it, and Angela Lansbury, who later went on to Murder, She Wrote. And it addresses the use of trauma-based mind control on military personnel, specifically in those Cold War military applications. So this is a clip from the movie here, and this tells us a lot about how MKUltra really works. It was, of course, presented as fiction, but truth often hides in plain sight under the guise of fiction. So here's what the movie told audiences in 1962, at which point MKUltra was well and truly off the ground and running strong back in that film.
The hydrangea is a very simple plant, but there are more complications. The cultivation of hydrangeas was evolved from a number of varieties originally found in Japan, not all of which, of course, have the same characteristics. Two of them do not share the quality of producing blue flowers in mineral-rich soils.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners, but I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word, to believe that they are waiting on a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club is in progress.
All right, so these are American soldiers who have been captured by Korea, and they've been brainwashed, as the guy says there, into thinking they're attending this women's group talking about hydrangeas and such. And the idea here is that they're going to be programmed to become assassins, enemy agents. And this is a big application of MKUltra in its early days. At least this is the way it was justified to the CIA. And the idea is that you could produce a mind-controlled assassin who could be sent out on a mission, and they afterwards retain no memory of what it is they've done. Or there's an element of suicide programming often built in, whereby once they've completed the assassination that they've been programmed to do, they then turn the gun on themselves to get rid of the evidence, so to speak. And this would appear to have gone on a number of times. And there are many real-world applications coming out of the movies into things that actually played out on the world stage. For example, when Robert F. Kennedy was shot in June 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, the blame was pinned on a lone gunman, isn't it always? In this case, a Palestinian guy named Sirhan Sirhan. This is him. And he has told the story that at the scene on that fateful night, there was a woman in a polka dot dress. This is her in the center. And this is classic of a trigger when it comes to mind control programming, because a skilled handler can cause the subject to go into that mind controlled state by way of a trigger. Often it can be a trigger phrase or a trigger word, it could be a color, or it can be a design, a pattern, such as in this case. And eyewitnesses have said that Sirhan shot Kennedy once this woman appeared on the scene, the suggestion being that she caused the trigger. He claims that he retains no memory of what happened that day. Went to jail for it for multiple decades. This is an interview from just a few years ago, where he's again insisting that he has no memory of what went on that day. This is classic of this style of mind control programming, where brainwashing and a mind wipe is built in to the programming.
Obviously I was there, but I don't remember the exact moment. I don't remember pulling my gun out of my body or wherever it was located, and I don't remember aiming at any human being. I don't remember any of that, Mr. President. And I've said that from the get-go.
Yeah,
So it's not that I'm trying to evade.
No, I understand that.
Strangely, Sirhan has said that since that incident, he's displayed an uncanny ability to be able to tell the time to within 1 minute without having access to a clock. Very strange thing. And when you realise that MKUltra is operational and has been for many decades, it starts to make sense of many world events that many of us will remember. So, for instance, in December 1980, John Lennon, we're told, was assassinated outside the Dakota building in New York. And the blame for that one was pinned on a lone gunman, again, a crazed fan, Mark David Chapman. This is the classic photo of John Lennon signing a copy of his new album, Double Fantasy, which had just come out, to Chapman. And then Chapman went away again for a few hours. John Lennon and Yoko Ono went off to a recording studio, and when they came back to Dakota, Chapman was waiting, and we're told he assumed a marksman's position and shot Lennon as he was going into the Dakota. Yoko had gone in before him, so she was out of the way. A few, lucky. Many people actually feel that Yoko could have served the role of John Lennon's mind control handler. And I would certainly go along with that suggestion. Because when it comes to subjects of this style of mind control, A handler is often inserted into their lives to make sure that they stay on track and to make sure that the programming is still intact and to report any anomalies back to their higher ups. And often the handler is a romantic partner or spouse. And so I feel that John Lennon was starting to become a bit of a loose cannon, and he was a bit unpredictable, he was speaking his own mind, and so Yoko was put into his world to fulfill that role as handler. And she kept a lid on things for the next several years until it was decided that Lennon had totally outlived his usefulness and was becoming too much of a liability, at which point they decided to take him out. And they used a mind-controlled assassin, Mark Chapman, to do the job. So Chapman, like Sirhan, also maintains that he can't remember a whole lot about that night. So he's been in jail for the past 45 and a half years. And this is an interview he did with Larry King on CNN in the early 90s, I think this was 1992, where he's recounting what he can remember about that event. And a lot of what he says here is very revealing.
I was standing there with a gun in my pocket. Knew you were going to shoot me. Steps on it. Knew you were going to shoot me. And so tried.
Strange effect.
Praying not to be, but knowing down deep it was probably come to that. Did you know it would be that night? Did you know?
Never done that before.
So I knew that morning. I had some sort of premonition that this was the last time I was going to leave the hotel. I hadn't seen him that night. That's what mentioned. I wasn't sure he was doing.
All right, that's a bit garbled. It sounds like he's on auto-tune. So we'll give that one a miss. But what he's basically saying is that he remembers taking out a copy of this book, The Catcher in the Rye, by J.D. Salinger. This is a classic book by American literary standards, to the point that it's been taught in schools, in English classes, for the past several decades, and still is. And that's because The Catcher in the Rye serves as a mind control trigger. It's full of phrases which set off the programming which is put in place in the minds of people like Mark Chapman and Sirhan. So Chapman says that after he'd shot Lennon, he took out a copy of this book and was calmly reading it when the cops arrived. He made no attempt to escape, as per the programming. And what's so interesting is that a couple of months after this event, there was an attempt on the life of Ronald Reagan, who had just come in as US President, with George Bush Sr. as his Vice President. So many people feel that was really Bush's presidency, with Reagan in place as just the public face, the puppet. So there was this guy, John Hinckley Jr., who turns out to have been friends with the Bushes. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. Same way the Bin Ladens were. And he attempted to shoot Ronald Reagan, succeeded in getting a bullet into him, but Reagan survived. And the interesting thing is that Hinckley, like Mark Chapman, was also reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, which certainly reinforces the notion that this book serves as a mind control trigger. It would also explain why it's been adopted so enthusiastically by American literary circles. The story tells of the central character, Holden Caulfield, and he's a social outcast and a highly dysfunctional character. And Mark Chapman said that he could totally identify with the character of Holden Caulfield, again, as per the programme. There are other stories which come up often when it comes to mind control triggers of the MKUltra variety, and one of them is The Wizard of Oz. This again would explain why this movie is on constant rotation and is so beloved of so many film fans, because it's intended to be that way. It's kept out there in the culture because it's serving more of a purpose than people might realise. And in that movie, we've got talk of going over the rainbow, somewhere over the rainbow. This addresses dissociation from reality, which is what happens to a mind-controlled slave. So the way trauma-based mind control works is the subject is exposed to horrific traumatic events. And they're so horrific that it causes the mind to fracture into different compartments. And what it's trying to do is dissociate from what's happening and tuck the trauma away somewhere in the recesses of the mind so it doesn't have to deal with it. And it creates these different compartments to do that. Each of these compartments can be programmed with its own individual personality. This leads to what used to be known as multiple personality disorder. These days it's called dissociative identity disorder. And the individual is dissociating from reality. So it's not engaging with what's actually happening. It goes into one of these altered states. And a phrase that's often used for this process is going over the rainbow. Dissociative mind control slaves talk of this. So this song in The Wizard of Oz is talking about that, because this stuff goes back a long way. This film was from 1939, so it predates MK Ultra's launch date, but this stuff was still going on back then. It's been there ever since the launch of Hollywood, the Hollywood film industry, which is all about mass mind control. And another story, which crops up time and time again, is the Alice stories from Lewis Carroll, Reverend Charles Dodgson, which is kind of appropriate because he was a dodgy character in terms of his extracurricular interests. He had this seemingly very unhealthy interest in this young girl, Alice Liddell, which led to the creation of the Alice stories. Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass. These are very surreal stories, and that's because they're addressing, again, mind-controlled states. That's what they're really all about. And they serve as triggers for those who have been programmed. They bring out the mind-controlled states. So this, again, would explain why the Alice stories are everywhere and are taught to kids and crop up in English classes and such, because they want these stories out there in the culture all the time, because they're serving a hidden purpose. We've had the truth placed in plain sight in Hollywood movies for decades in terms of how MK Ultra works. And one film which did a really good job of exposing this, although most people thought it was just fiction, was a movie called Telephone from 1977. It starred Charles Bronson and Lee Remick, and Donald Pleasance stars as the handler. He's the guy that programs all these Russian agents, it turns out. So they're Russian double agents, and they've been embedded in American society in regular run-of-the-mill jobs. And they've got this trigger phrase, which has been programmed into their minds, and Donald Pleasance phones them up at an opportune time and whispers the trigger phrase down the phone, which is why it's called telephone. And that causes them to click into their mind-controlled state and instantly become assassins. So we've got one clip from the film here which shows this process in action. No idea why this is happening with the audio. No, it looks like I'll have to do the subtitles. So we got this garage hand, this mechanic here, who everyone thinks is just a regular American guy, and he takes the phone call, and it's Donald Pleasance as the handler, and he says this trigger phrase, which is like an excerpt from a novel, and it causes him to dissociate, and he clicks into this mind-controlled state, and in the next scene he drives his truck into an American military base, causing it to explode. That's his mission, because he's actually a Russian double agent. We also had a very humorous reference to MK Ultra in action in one of the Naked Gun movies with Leslie Nielsen. So I'll do this one without the audio, I'll just play the scene. So we've got this guy here, and the guy at the desk is demonstrating how his secretary has been brain chipped to become a mind-controlled assassin. So she's asking him how he likes his tea, and then he presses the switch, and she becomes this assassin trying to shoot him. And she says, I must kill him, as per the programming. And there's the suicide programming. She's trying to kill herself once her mission is complete. And then the guy presses the switch again, turns the chip off, and she asks him how many sugars he wants in his tea. She's got no memory of what went on. So it's presented in the film as, very humorous, and I'm sure people chuckled at it at the time thinking how ridiculous, but actually it really goes on. And we got a very incisive glimpse there into how this dynamic works. There was a very real program which took place in the early 1970s on Montauk Island, which is just off of Long Island, New York, a military base called Camp Hero. This is it, now disused. But this place involved experiments on primarily young boys, teenage boys, and it was kind of a side project to MKUltra, whereby they were trying to develop psychic skills which could be put to use in military applications. So specifically, this involved remote viewing. And the idea was that they were going to train up these psychically sensitive teenage boys to remote view on enemy agents, the Soviets. Very few of the boys involved in that program survived. One of them who did was this guy, Stuart Swerdlow, who has since done a bunch of podcasts and interviews talking about what happened at Montauk. And this is one of the interviews he gave, where he's just talking about how grim that place was. And what's so interesting to me about Montauk is the fact that this served as the original inspiration for that Netflix TV series Stranger Things. So the surface narrative to Stranger Things is it's all about these monsters that kind of come through this other dimension, this portal between these two worlds, and there's all these explosions and crazy monsters and stuff like that, which seems to be why most people like that show. Why I like it is because initially it was going to be titled Montauk, because the creators of it, the Duffer Brothers, the writers, knew all about what went on at Camp Hero Montauk Point, and they wanted to encode that into the narrative of their show. The title was later changed to Stranger Things. Possibly they were a bit close to the mark with their original title, but there are some very clear references to what happened at Montauk in the show. So in the first season, we're introduced to this shady governmental facility, the Department of Energy, ostensibly, in Hawkins, Indiana, which is a fictional town. So the show was going to be set in Montauk, New York, and then they changed it to this town in Indiana which doesn't actually exist, possibly to take some of the heat off the real narrative. And you've got this Department of Energy governmental building, which is quite clearly an MKUltra experimental laboratory. And the narrative revolves around this one particular kid, played by Millie Bobby Brown, and she's known as 11. That's her code name. Interesting number when you get into numerology and the occult and stuff like that. And what they're trying to do in this facility is develop these psychic abilities within her so that she can go on these missions to spy on enemy agents. This is stuff that really went on. It's just being presented here under the guise of fiction. So you see her taking part in all these mind experiments to see just how far her consciousness and her psychic abilities can be stretched. And we get this very revealing glimpse into how remote viewing actually works. So I'll just play the clip here. She's in a tank, so it's akin to a sensory deprivation tank. She's totally immersed in water. They put up the shields on the sides of the tank so she can't see anything. She's completely cut off from the outside world, and she's focusing on going into this altered state, whereby she effectively goes out of her body and her consciousness is projected elsewhere. In this case, to this enemy agent, this Russian military guy that she's been told to spy on. So this is the symbolic representation of what's going on when she finds this guy, taps into his energy field and is able to psychically spy on what he's saying and then report back on it. And then monitoring the results back in the laboratory there. That's Brenner based on Ewan Cameron. So I think they did a pretty good job of explaining how this stuff works in that show. These are the most interesting elements of the show, in my opinion. Forget all the monsters and all the explosions and all that nonsense. So this was very real. You know, there's papers on an evaluation of remote viewing, research and applications. This one is dated 1995. And it's a very real thing, you know. It happened, probably still does. Then elsewhere in Stranger Things, we get a specific mention of MKUltra. So you've got these characters here, Jim Hopper, the police chief, played by David Harbour, and Winona Ryder's character. And they're going to see the sister of this woman who was a test subject within MKUltra. And they've since fried her brains because a big part of the experimentation involved mind-altering drugs like LSD. And many of the subjects didn't come off very well as a result of that. And in this narrative, Terry Ives, who is the mother of 11, it turns out, her child was taken from her as part of the mind control program. Her mind's totally gone. And her sister is explaining to these other two that it was MKUltra and it was a very real creation of the CIA. So audiences of that TV show were getting told the truth about stuff that really went on. But most of them probably thought it was just an entertaining fictional TV show, right? And this is what they like to do so often, the controllers of organised society. I talk about this a lot in my music industry work because there's this phenomenon known as predictive programming. And this is where you get a depiction of a real world event which is yet to happen, embedded into popular culture vehicles. So you'll see expressions of it in movies, TV shows, music videos, cartoons, ads, live stage shows like the US Super Bowl halftime show, the Grammys, the MTV VMAs, things of this nature. And the controllers of these different aspects of society are at their core base level dark occultists, many of them Satanists. This is what drives a lot of their activity. This is why they engage in so much ritualistic behaviour, because they're adhering to their sick, twisted, spiritual, religious belief systems. They like it when people scoff at that stuff. They love it when people say, oh, that's nonsense, I don't believe in all that, because it enables them to carry on unimpeded in what they're doing. If you're prepared to accept that they are dark occultists and they are adhering to rituals, it does explain so much of what goes on. Particularly in music, it explains a lot of the symbolism that we see, the signs and the sigils that we see everywhere. It explains a lot of the agendas that you can see getting pushed. It explains a lot of the images that you find on record sleeves and in music videos and things like this. And it explains a lot of what goes into movies and TV shows. So they're often telling you the truth of what goes on in the world. They do it in the guise of fiction. Various reasons why they do it. They want people to make a psychic connection with the scenario that's being portrayed. They feel they can get themselves off the karmic hook and escape the consequentialism that would ordinarily come down to bear on them as a result of their actions by putting the emphasis onto the masses. So when they see it, when they've announced what they're doing and what they're all about or what they plan to do, they often do it in cryptic, coded form or in the form of numerology, symbolism. So not being entirely open about it, but nevertheless, as they see it, they've given us the opportunity to comprehend what it is they're all about. And if we're then too dumb or too profane or too spiritually ignorant to recognise what's being conveyed, well then, that's not their problem. They've shifted the emphasis from themselves onto us. That's the way they see it. It's a sick, twisted way of looking at things, but these are sick, twisted individuals, mentally ill psychopaths. Unfortunately, they control everything. They just forgot to tell us. So, a lot of the stuff gets conveyed under the radar, and it's being aimed straight at the subconscious minds of the masses, because that's where all the magic takes place. The conscious mind is only capable of processing relatively small amounts of information at any given time. But the subconscious absorbs hundreds of thousands of pieces of information during the course of a day. And there's a kind of filtration process whereby it discerns that which needs to be drawn through into the conscious mind, where it can be recognised and acted upon, and that which is deemed unimportant at this stage. And that gets tucked into the recesses of the subliminal mind. That's where the programming takes place. And it's achieved through entertainment and popular culture. It's been weaponised. Music, movies, TV shows have been weaponised by very clever psychological practitioners. So we think we're just watching a film and it's not having any kind of effect on us, but actually it is on a subconscious level. And then even in terms of the exoteric narrative of the movie, often we're getting told great truths in the guise of the movie. So how about this one? There was a film, came out in 1997, called Conspiracy Theory, right there in plain sight. Some of you may have seen it. It starred Mel Gibson as a cab driver, and the start of the film has him driving through the streets of New York, and he's yapping away to his passengers in the cab, talking about this, talking about that, speaking very quickly and apparently incoherently. And they're trying to get across the idea that this guy is a bit crazy. He's a bit, kooky. But actually, everything that he says can be shown to be true. He's talking about how they've been putting fluoride in the water supply for decades to make the population docile, to dumb them down, to make them more open to suggestion. That's a very real thing. He talks about how all the American presidents have been 33rd degree Freemasons. It's a very real thing. Most people watching the film would think, oh, this guy, Jerry, he's crazy. Listen to him rambling on about all this nonsense. It's not nonsense. And then later on in the film, we come to learn that Jerry, this cab driver guy, was actually a subject within MKUltra. They name it. They refer to it. They let the audience know that this was a very real thing coming out of the CIA. They do claim that it was wrapped up in the 1970s, which, as I've said, I don't buy. But the reason why Jerry is said to be so crazy is because he underwent all this programming as part of the MKUltra regime. So it's right there in that film. It's not so much fiction as fact. Many subdivisions of MKUltra, it was a very elaborate and far-reaching thing. And one of them involved the 1960s counterculture. So the sex, drugs and rock and roll lifestyle that was unleashed on the baby boomer generation in the 1960s. And that was when LSD came on the scene in seemingly never-ending quantities. And there's documentation that's come out to show that the CIA was the main pusher of all the LSD and all the other psychedelics and mind-altering drugs that were around in the 60s. The CIA are the biggest pushers of drugs on Earth, always have been. There was a precursor to that whole scene though, and it seems they were trying to lay a few of the foundations and do a bit of table setting the decade before, in the late 1950s. So in my other talk on the music industry, I used 1955 as my main starting point to illustrate how culture has been completely weaponized by social engineers. So prior to 1955, in both American and British society, the music scene was quite staid and very austere and quite boring, frankly. It was the post-World War II era, it was the Cold War era, and there was no such thing as youth culture to speak of. 1955 changed all that. That's when rock and roll music first hit the US. The likes of Bill Haley and his comics with Rock Around the Clock laid the foundations for everything else that was to come. Elvis Presley came out the following year, 1956. then you had all these other rock and roll superstars, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, all these kinds of names. There were new drugs coming on the scene, primarily amphetamine, speed, back in those times, and just changing attitudes to everything, to sex, to family, to the generations. Basically, discord was getting fomented between the different generations, the young people of the time and their parents' generation and the value system that they represented. This is what social engineers, psychologists, behavioural scientists love to do. They like discord in society. They like playing one group off against another. You'll probably be hearing about that dynamic a lot more this weekend. They've been doing it forever. And they've weaponized music and culture through which to get that job done. So they did a brilliant job of it in the 1960s, but prior to that, they were starting to get society in general used to the idea of entheogens, hallucinogens, psychedelics, whatever name you want to apply to it. Mind-altering drugs, effectively. So some of them are natural, like mescaline and peyote, things like this, cannabis, and others are laboratory produced, like the LSD that was coming out in the 1960s. In 1957, this guy, R. Gordon Wasson, went on a trip to Mexico to hang out with the indigenous populations down there and to experiment with some of the psilocybin mushrooms that they were using to go into altered states of consciousness. The story was carried on the cover of the May 1957 edition of Life magazine, and it was getting the American public used to the idea of these mind-altering drugs, ready for what was already known to be coming the following decade. The reason this story is pertinent is because through a Freedom of Information Act request, the pay requisition for Wasson's trip to Mexico was unearthed. And that trip was paid for by the CIA as Sub-Project 58 of MKUltra. So his trip to Mexico wasn't some random thing. He was being paid to go down there by the CIA as a prelude to what they planned to do the following decade in the 1960s. Wasson's day job was as head of propaganda for JP Morgan Bank. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to because they do it for you. So by the 1960s, culture was changed beyond all recognition. So as well as musicians, you had a whole bunch of the bands and the music makers in that decade that were pushing these changing styles of music. So psychedelic rock was coming in to replace everything else that had gone before it. You had all the drugs, the LSD, everything else. And you also had consciousness gurus coming on the scene, like Dr. Timothy Leary, who was an academic, a Harvard professor coming out of that whole world. And reportedly, he was axed from his job at the university for encouraging his students to go on these journeys of discovery and embrace higher states of consciousness through taking drugs like LSD. It was presented as just some kind of organic thing. It was just a personal mission that Leary was on. And he was also embracing Eastern mysticism, which was a big part of everything that was going on in the 60s. It was this big cocktail of influences. Eastern mysticism, the mind-altering drugs, psychedelic rock, changing attitudes towards family, towards sex. The birth control pill arrived right at the same time as all this stuff was going on. The birth of modern feminism through Gloria Steinem. And it turns out, by Leary's own admission in his latter years, that all along he had been an asset of the CIA on the payroll. Also, Gloria Steinem, who was the proprietor of Ms. magazine, and she was a big proponent of feminism, her whole thing was trying to get women into the workplace to become the equal of their male peers. And she sold it as, hey sisters, we're just as good as the guys out there, we could be doing all these jobs. But the real agenda was getting women out of their nurturing positions as mothers in the home, getting them to put their children into state-sponsored childcare at ever earlier ages where the mind control and the indoctrination can begin, and getting them into the workplace. This also had the added benefit for the psychopaths in control of having ever larger numbers in the workforce contributing to the taxation system. So everyone's a winner, if you're a psychopathic Satanist, that is. So that's what was going on, and it was all happening at the hands of the CIA, because it was all part of the wider remit of MKUltra, which was to completely transform American society. And I think it's fair to say that the ripples from what was done in the 1960s in terms of changing attitudes to sex, drugs and rock and roll are still being felt today. So from that perspective, it can be said to have been a highly successful program. Gloria Steinem, by the way, was also an asset of the CIA on the payroll. All these figures that were being promoted in the 60s as part of the counterculture were connected to the CIA. Here's another one. Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters. So when all the hippie festivals and the music events got going in the 60s, the Summer of Love, LSD was everywhere, other drugs, psychedelic rock music, and there was this troupe known as Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters who used to go around to all these music festivals distributing free tabs of LSD. Endless quantities. They would just give it out to all the kids that were attending these festivals. Ken Kesey was the author of the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was later made into a movie starring Jack Nicholson, and it documented Kesey's time as an inmate in an MKUltra hospital. He was one of the test subjects. That's what that book and film are all about. And he went out there with a bunch of other suspect characters who were equally connected to MKUltra and the CIA to make sure all the drugs got distributed where they should at all these music events. Because the music didn't make much sense without the drugs. It was all part of the changing culture of the times. Same thing was happening over here on British shores. There was a British counterpart to what was going on in California, largely centred around London, but also with pockets in Cambridge, coming out of Cambridge University. Because a lot of social engineering and culture shaping gets done through Oxford and Cambridge universities. You'll find that with the whole COVID scam of 2020 and beyond, that entire PSYOP was cooked up largely out of Oxford University and also through the Tavistock Institute in London, which is the world centre for psychological operations. Beginning into Tavistock in part 2 of this talk. So in the 60s you had, again, psychedelic rock music that was coming through, and the LSD was starting to appear everywhere in London and beyond. Where were all the drugs coming from? Well, the so-called security and intel services, who are supposed to keep people safe from all this stuff, are the ones that were putting it out there. I know, hard to believe, I know. I'm glad we're all sitting down to recover from the shock, but that is the case. And you had various bands that were pushing all this culture in London. One of them was the earliest incarnation of Pink Floyd. Sorry, Floyd fans. Don't worry, I'll be pissing other people off with their favourite bands later as well, so it's not just you. I'm very fair like that. So they were known in the 60s as the Pink Floyd. And when they first emerged, they had Syd Barrett, real name Roger, whereas Roger Waters' real name is George. I do hope you're paying attention, there'll be questions later. So Syd Barrett was the front man of this group, and he came out of Cambridge. And they were a very different group when they first emerged to the one most people know, Dark Side of the Moon and their whole progressive rock style. When they first started out, they were pushing psychedelic culture. They were the in-house band at a venue called the UFO Club in London, which was one of the main meeting places for all the kids that were into the emerging culture of the times. LSD was there, and Pink Floyd were playing this psychedelic rock music. Well, Syd Barrett was the primary singer-songwriter for Pink Floyd back in those times, but he didn't last very long, because by 1967, he'd had to be kicked out of the group. And this is because, we're told, the official account of things is that he fried his brains doing too much acid, LSD, recreationally. I think something else was going on, because Syd Barrett's father worked out of Cambridge University on behalf of the British government on mind control research. And it's often the offspring of military personnel or governmental personnel who were used as test subjects for any experimentation that needs to go on. They're unwitting guinea pigs. So it wouldn't surprise me if Syd Barrett was used as part of his father's experimentation into mind control and was given copious amounts of LSD to study what would happen to his brain, to his consciousness under these conditions. And the experimentation went badly wrong, to the point that Syd was never the same again. And so he was kicked out of the band, replaced by David Gilmour, and never wrote another song. And he died aged 60 in 2000. There's a similar story when it comes to Fleetwood Mac, incidentally. The infamous Munich incident, so-called, dating back to the 22nd of March, the time of the spring equinox, in 1970, where some members of that band went out to Munich to play a show, and they were met by some characters at the airport that nobody really knew who they were, and a couple of that group, Peter Green, who'd been hailed as one of the greatest guitarists of all time up to that point, and Danny Kirwan, were taken off to this commune, like a hippie-type commune in the countryside somewhere, and given LSD, and they were never the same again. And both of them ended up being kicked out of the group. They became very erratic and unpredictable. They couldn't perform songs properly anymore. So that smacks also of having been a massive experimentation program involving a couple of very well-known rock groups. And we got some very revealing symbolism here in this compilation album of Syd Barrett's songs. When you know what the symbolism is telling you, this picture speaks volumes. So whenever you see an artist interacting with a mirror, the mirror is symbolic of the mind and different compartments of the mind. What you'll often see in music videos, I've got a separate talk where I go into many of the videos from the early 1980s that were made for the emerging MTV channel at that time. Many of them were getting directed by very well-known Hollywood producers, directors, and there was no expense spared. They were big budget, very lavish, very elaborate affairs, because they were communicating things through symbolism. And many of those videos in the early 80s had symbolism pertaining to trauma-based mind control. But in the 1980s, nobody knew how to decipher this stuff because we didn't have the internet. We couldn't do that research for ourselves. These days, we can. We can know better if we care to. We can learn to speak the language of the symbolism that the controllers use. So you'll often see mirrors or windows that are shattered. And this is symbolizing the shattered components of the mind, where these different alters, these different personalities can reside. So we've got Syd Barrett here in a mask, a creepy, eyes wide shut style carnival mask, which is how these so-called elites like to get down at their masked balls. We saw it in Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut movie, which gave a glimpse into these very real events. And it appears in so many of the early 80s pop music videos. You see these Rothschild-style mansions with these masked balls taking place. You see Freemasonic symbolism everywhere, black and white checkerboard floors, because many of the controllers of the industry are going to turn out to be Freemasons. You've also got here some emblems of childhood icons and motifs, like teddy bears, you've got a toy plane, and what this is symbolizing is the lost innocence of childhood that happens to many of these subjects. because many of them are unfortunate enough to have been born into the wrong family. A lot of how prominent figures in society get selected for their roles is simply down to the families that they happen to be born into. Family bloodlines. Genealogy, DNA, ancestry accounts for a lot. This is how many successful pop stars are selected. It's the same thing with Hollywood actors. It's the same thing with business leaders and politicians. Not exclusively, but in many cases. It's a bloodline family thing. And when you're born into one of these families, you can expect to be richly abused and traumatized from a very young age. They want to catch the mind while it's still developing in early childhood and get that traumatic programming in place. So in many of these videos and films and such, you see things like teddy bears and dolls, and often they'll have missing limbs. They'll be missing a leg or an arm or an eye or something like that. And this speaks to the trauma that these people undergo in childhood. So it's very sick, and it's not very fun and not very entertaining, but that's how it's presented to the general public when they don't really know what to look for in terms of what's really going on. So I think with this Syd Barrett sleeve, we're getting an insight into the type of existence he had and the type of life that he was born into. And he's very far from an isolated example. Trust me, I could cite hundreds and hundreds of these, have done in the books and in many of the other talks. Another surefire way of detecting where trauma has been present comes from an expression which has been described as the 1,000-yard stare. And we find this often in military veterans who have undergone PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So they've been in a warfare situation and they've seen some absolute horrors. And it causes them to dissociate. So it's like children that are getting programmed in the labs. What they're witnessing is so horrific for their minds to process that it causes that dissociation from reality. And it results in this look whereby, you know, the lights are on but there's nobody home. Because the mind isn't consciously engaging. They've gone somewhere else. They've gone over the rainbow, symbolically speaking. So this is a look we see in certain celebrities. You know, Robbie Williams, 1 part cocaine, 2 parts MK Ultra, probably. Russell Brand, same way. Yeah, almost certainly mind controlled to be doing the stuff that he does and the role that he's been fulfilling. And going back to Robbie Williams, we've got another telltale sign indicating the presence of mind control, in my view, and in the view of other researchers. And this is when they appear with peroxide blonde dyed hair. What this is symbolising to those who can read the language is that this individual has been tampered with. This individual has had their mind control topped up. So there was a point where Robbie Williams appeared in the public eye with the dyed blonde hair, and he ticks all the boxes, in my view, for being a mind control subject. He's got a wife now who looks very much like a handler, like she's been put into his world to keep an eye on him. That's what goes on with many of these celebrities. And we get the dyed blonde hair with many of these male celebs, these male artists. Eminem, when he first emerged on the scene in the late 90s, his trademark look was the peroxide blonde hair. This means something. It's not just some throwaway fashion expression. More recently, we've had Justin Bieber, again, a very obvious candidate for having been mind controlled. They like their assets, their key names that they promote, to be under their control. They don't want maverick free spirits expressing themselves in their own way. They want to be completely in control of the agendas that they're pushing. And we get these little indicators every now and again of those that they've got in their grip. So I think this is what was going on with Justin Bieber, who has displayed some very alarming behaviour over the years, and it's all very consistent with him having been mind controlled and with that programming often breaking down. causing them to behave in these very strange ways. Kanye West, who has made some very controversial statements over the years and behaved in some very unpredictable, erratic ways, ticking all the boxes for having been an MK Ultra subject. And here he is, pictured with the dyed blonde hair, looking very dissociated, looking, very outside of himself. And this, again, is an indicator of what's been done to him. There was a time where he was dating Kim Kardashian, and I will suggest again that's a mind control subject and handler type relationship, which was arranged for him. Spoiler alert, the marriage didn't last. A surprise, I know. But I think Kanye did us a favour a few years ago when he put out this tweet, or he retweeted this message that he'd received from this guy named Harley Pasternak. And this guy is described as a personal trainer to the stars. So he's supposed to be some sort of therapist guy, that helps them develop themselves and such. But his true nature would appear to be that of a particularly vicious mind control handler. So Kanye put out this message which Harley Pasternak had sent to him. And Harley had said, "I'm going to help you one of a couple of ways. First, you and I sit down and have a loving and open conversation, but you don't use cuss words, and everything that's discussed is based in fact and not some crazy stuff that dumb friend of yours told you or you saw in a tweet. Second option, I have you institutionalized again, where they medicate the crap out of you and you go back to zombie land forever. Play date with the kids just won't be the same again." Nice, man. But a very clear insight there into what goes on with many of these music artists and Hollywood actors and such. I think we probably got a clue in the James Bond film From Russia with Love, 1963, Sean Connery's second film as Bond, where we had Robert Shaw portraying the hired killer, Red Grum, who's working for the Russians. And he appeared with dyed blonde hair. Robert Shaw wasn't blonde, but he was for this film. And earlier in the movie, we see him at this sort of training camp, where he's being presented as some sort of super soldier. And this is an aspect of the mind control programming where it creates individuals who are resistant to pain. They don't need sleep, they don't need food. They operate like automatons, like robots, because of the way the mind has been programmed. We got insights into this through the Bourne films, starring Matt Damon, who was an asset of the CIA, but they were telling you right there in those films what they do to many of their own, the programming they undergo to create these kind of super soldier type assassins. So then we come on to the female celebs, and these are much more obvious candidates for having been trauma-based mind control. Miley Cyrus, with the dyed blonde hair, that was her look of a few years ago. Katy Perry, in and out of the public spotlight, often appearing with dyed blonde hair, and this indicates that she's been into the lab to have the programming topped up. And the classic example of this was when Britney Spears, many years ago, 2004, did an interview with Diane Sawyer, where in the middle of the interview, you actually get to see Britney dissociating from reality. The mind control programming is starting to wear off, and you see her slip into one of these alternate alters. So I'm not sure the audio is going to work, probably not, but we got the visuals anyway.
Test a lot.
Oh, it's working.
Illness in the family. A breakup. This spasm of publicity about what happened from Mexico to London.
It was pretty rough, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Weird. Hello. Oh my goodness. Hello. Ew. Strawberry. Yeah, it was so weird. Ew. And then the earth's going.
So, a lot of people look at the lives of celebrities, particularly kids that want to be famous, you know, young girls will look at somebody like Britney Spears and say, oh, I wish I had her life, I'd like to be just like her. You wouldn't, as it turns out, because their lives are sheer hell. They're born into this, they have no choice in the matter, and here she is dissociating and breaking down into one of these altars right in the middle of an interview. And I think what caused that was a trigger phrase uttered by the interviewer, who probably knew what she was doing. It's where she says, from London to Mexico. That seemed to cause the reaction. With female celebrities, we also have a division of MKUltra mind control. The main one that's used on celebrities generally is called monarch programming. We'll get to that again shortly. But there's a division of that which is known as beta sex kitten programming. And the original prototype for a beta sex slave was Marilyn Monroe, when she transformed from Norma Jean Baker into the invented persona of Marilyn Monroe. And her trademark look right from the start was the peroxide blonde hair. She was a presidential model. She was gifted to both JFK and RFK as a sex slave, effectively. And she was the prototype for all the others that would follow in her wake. And she was got rid of in 1962 at the age of 36, presumably, to hide the evidence. So many celebrities have followed in the wake of Marilyn Monroe, and they've based their look on her at some point or other in their careers. One is Madonna, who used to say that she felt she was the reincarnation of Marilyn Monroe. A slight difficulty arises from the fact that Madonna was born in 1958 and Marilyn didn't die until 62, but still she was making these comments. And I think she was kind of channeling Marilyn Monroe in terms of the sort of role that she was fulfilling. Madonna's main rival in the pop music stakes in the 1980s for a time was Cyndi Lauper, and here she is, dressed up looking like Marilyn Monroe, because this is the beta programming. And often you find these assets in animal-style print, so they'll wear dresses with kind of leopard or tiger print or whatever it is, and this is suggestive of the animalistic kind of base desires that are brought through as part of the sex kitten programming. So they're embracing that instinctive kind of animalistic aspect of themselves when they go into these altered states. And a clue is when you see the artists in this animal print design. There's lots of them out there when you really start paying attention. So monarch programming is the main one that's used on these celebrities. This is Beyonce, and we've got some one-eye symbolism here. This is one of the calling cards of the controllers of the industry. They like to announce themselves with their cute little signs and symbols. It's the one-eye sign. Sometimes they do the pyramid. Sometimes they do the so-called 666 sign, or the Baphomet horn hand sign. It's their little way of identifying themselves. And monarch programming is based around this breed of butterfly known as the monarch butterfly. It's got a very distinctive design, usually orange, and in a surprisingly high amount of pop music videos, you see female artists interacting for no apparent reason with one of these monarch butterflies. And that's symbolically conveying the fact that they've been programmed as part of Monarch and MKUltra. As I mentioned, we often have romantic partners put in there as mind control handlers. I feel that's what was going on with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, also Kanye and Kim, Robbie Williams and his wife. And just before we go to the break here, we've got an example of a mind control subject and handler relationship right there in plain sight. So you may recall that Russell Brand, for a few years, was married to Katy Perry. Spoiler alert, the marriage didn't last. Hard to believe, I know. But this is an awards do, it's like a red carpet do, where Russell Brand and Katy Perry are caught by an interviewer, and Katy starts to answer the question, but Russell doesn't like the way she's answering it. And because he's her handler, he tries to take control of the situation. It's very revealing when you realise what's going on. So hopefully we got the audio to it. Let's take a listen to this.
What did you think of the whole shebang? I thought it was... What? I pipsqueaks come over and then Sneezy went, no, as we went off, you just put it right in it now. I did watch that.
That's bullshit.
That's no, oh, this is modern television. This is modern thing in England. So listen, who are you happy to see win? I mean, I'm happy that for everyone, really. Just everyone. People that won, people that were nominated, people that were just there. Idiots, unsung heroes, the people that fill the seats. Katie, how do you deal with it?
That was actually hilarious.
How'd you find it fun?
Speechless. Usually I'm the bubbly and I'm just like, oh my god, you're so funny, I can't believe it.
Have a lovely night, and we've been pulled away back left and centre.
So, when Russell was trying to take control of the situation there, he did something. Did you notice what it was? Yes. So, maybe we should replay that for those who missed it. But there's a point where he takes out a little pendant and it's got the word obey on it. And he flashes it momentarily. Katie catches a glimpse of it, and then she starts to behave the way she's been trained to behave. So Russell is her handler, and he's trying to take control of the situation, just like at the end there, he's pulling her off, pulling her away from the cameras. So let's take another look and notice this time what he's doing with that obey sign.
What did you think of the whole shebang? I thought it was... My favourite bit was when Chalky each fell over on the carpet, and then pipsqueaks come over.
Sorry to put you through this again.
As we went off, you just put it right in it now. I did watch that
That's bullshit.
That's no, oh, this is modern television. This is modern thing in England. So listen, who are you happy to see win? I mean, I'm happy that for everyone, really. Just everyone. People that won.
So when you see the video proper, you can identify the word obey. So that's what's going on there. And that gives us a very valuable insight into the relationship between handlers and subjects. And it's a very obvious expression of the fact that mind control goes on in popular culture and entertainment, as it goes on elsewhere in society. But popular culture and entertainment is an aspect of it that people often miss, because nobody's expecting to be mind controlled and to have their views and opinions and outlooks shaped and moulded for them when they think they're just listening to music or watching a film or watching a TV show. That's why it's so skillful, the way they've weaponised these walks of life. And when you realise what gets done, and you recognise the methods and the tactics that they use, you'll never be fooled in the same way again, because you've broken the magician's spell. So it becomes very important for people to become simple literate, so that when these things get flashed in front of you, your conscious mind is engaged and you recognise them for what they are, rather than you're absorbing it into the subconscious mind, where it could be having an unseen effect on you without your conscious knowledge. So that's why it's so important that people learn to recognise the language of symbolism and the way this stuff works. So that, in a nutshell, is an encapsulation of MK Ultra, probably only just scratching the surface. Another aspect of what gets done comes through this organisation I've alluded to, known as Tavistock. And this is the second part of the talk. But at this stage, we'll take a break of about 20 minutes or so